In this video, I'll be sharing my full process of making some of my sculptural animal mugs with the use of plaster molds. I begin by creating my mugs on the wheel. I find the process of creating wheel throw forms to be very meditative and satisfying. I learned how to throw pottery on the wheel when I was a teenager and have continued to practice and explore this wonderful tool for creating vessels. The continuous motion of the wheel with the clay as the center holds a very ancient story of form and motion. By maintaining consistent pressure with my hands, the clay will become centered. I like to add symbolic details to each piece, beginning with the spiral at the bottom of the cup. It's in the stillness and consistent pressure from the artist that the form can emerge from the centrifugal force of the clay in motion. Even though I'm creating a three-dimensional form, I'm physically creating the shape on a two-dimensional line. It is the motion of the wheel that creates the three-dimensional shape. With the upward motion and consistent pressure, I guide the clay into a cylindrical shape. I generally achieve the shape that I'm going for within 3 pulls. Most of my mugs begin on the wheel from 1 to 2 pounds of clay. I create one-of-a-kind pieces that vary in shape and size. Once the mugs are thrown, they need to dry a bit before I trim the bottoms. Trimming a foot on the bottom of each piece not only looks good, it also serves a function. By having just a rim line at the bottom of the mug rather than a flat surface, the surface area is much smaller, and when in contact with a table or a counter, it does not transfer as much heat, therefore your drinks will stay cooler or hotter longer. It is important to me to create pieces that are not only functional, that also hold deeper meaning and reverence for the act of creating. My work is a spiritual practice of presence with each step and to bring forth images that provoke thought and connection to nature and universal principles. Each of my forms has a mandala that I hand carve. This practice of making mandalas gives each piece my meditative presence and adds a glimpse of the patterns found in nature's design. Complex patterns are often made up of simple shapes repeating in different mathematical combinations and angles. Infinite variations can be accomplished using these simple techniques. Once the mugs have been thrown, trimmed, and the foot decorated with a mandala, I pull the amount of handles I need for the batch of mugs from one large piece of clay. The handles need to set up for a few hours before attaching and pulling into their final shape. Here's a little flashback of my animal sculpting and mold making process. Some time ago, I sculpted this otter from a Plastilina clay in order to replicate it by creating a plaster mold from the original. I've been hand sculpting animal mugs for years and found that they often took hours to sculpt each one individually. At some point, I realized it would be beneficial to create some press molds of the animals that I often sculpted. I would be able to save time and still create one-of-a-kind pieces. When creating press molds, I create a relief sculpture onto a thick plastic sheet with Plastilina clay. I enjoy sculpting with Plastilina for mold making because I can get a lot of detail and the clay doesn't dry out or stick to the plaster. I can also reuse it to sculpt many different pieces. Plastilina is an oil-based clay, therefore cannot be fired in a kiln. If you are new to sculpture and are wanting to practice many forms, I recommend trying different types of clay. On this channel, I most often share my work in water-based clays for ceramic applications, but there are times like these that I take the opportunity to experiment with other types of clay. Sculpting animals is a super great way to expand creatively and work with animal medicine. When making a mold, I use an acrylic mold box and seal the seams with clay. When I filmed this originally, I was not as well versed in plaster mold making and didn't weigh out my plaster correctly. The mold still worked, but was not as nice as it could be. When making plaster molds, I recommend using an online plaster calculator. I will link one in the description below. The plaster I'm using sets up pretty quickly, but takes time to fully dry out. Once my molds are made, I let them dry out in the sun for a few days before use to ensure that all the moisture has been evaporated. I've had these molds for a while now and have made many mugs from them. Press molds are pretty straightforward. The goal is to get an accurate, clear impression without having to resculpt too much detail. By creating a ball of clay and pressing it firmly and evenly into the mold, I'm able to distribute the clay into the details and contours of the concave impression. I generally make a batch of 20 to 30 mugs at a time and create the impressions all at once so that I can assemble them in one go. I go through the same process of pressing and leveling the clay with all my molds. Once I get through the stack of molds, I take them out. Some of the animal impressions are super easy to press and release, while others have to be reshaped or have features that need to be rebuilt. Like this lion's nose that didn't get properly pressed, so I just resculpt that feature. Some of the impressions are more difficult to remove. The frog has an undercut that the clay can get caught in due to how I made the sculpture and mold, but has other advantages like the versatility of the shape. I'm able to move the legs around in different positions when attaching to a vessel. Something I love about working with press molds and hand-thrown pieces is that they are all still one of a kind and can have unique details added to each piece. The process of attaching is the same with any clay connection. I score the area and add slip, ensuring that there is a good connection and no air bubbles that will weaken the structural integrity. With each piece, I add some unique sculptural elements by adding details to the features. With the lion, I'm able to accentuate the mane with hand-carved elements while I smear the clay to create a strong bond. I like to add details to each piece, making it one of a kind. Each animal gets a unique design on the mug and around the motif. Often I use a compass to create my guidelines for a more symmetrical design. When creating the impressions, I find it easiest to lay out the design before attaching the sculpture. I work with a lot of patterns that have symbolic significance within the collective psyche throughout the world. Patterns that are found in nature and reflected in human history. There are shapes that resonate with us all without us being fully conscious of them. They are the shapes and patterns that make up the universe and natural design. Creating a motif within a circle opens up a lot of creative potential. I like to begin with a circle and a cross-section with many designs. It creates a natural framework that helps the eye find symmetry and separates the patterns to create a more cohesive and centered design that can frame the sculptural element. Working with patterns inspired by natural design gives me an opportunity to explore and understand the complexity of nature and our place in it. Many patterns that are derivative from natural occurring structures appear throughout the universe in the form of plant patterns, the movement of planets, and the geometric structures of animals, and the beautiful creatures that work in a symbiotic relationship with nature and keep balance in all things. There's so much beauty in the natural occurring patterns of life that I like to celebrate it in my art. Once all the mugs have been decorated, I move on to attaching and pulling the handles. There are many ways to create a handle on a mug. The method that I most often implement is to first pre-pull the handles and set them aside to stiffen, and then attach the handles to the mug by scoring the mug and handle and painting slip onto each surface. With gentle pressure, attaching it and smearing the handle into the vessel, I pull the handle directly off the mug and create the shape that I'm wanting by gently coercing the clay from each side into my desired shape. With the help of gravity and motion, I achieve the arced angle of the handle that looks aesthetically pleasing and functionally comfortable. I like to add carved details to each handle to add to the overall design. In some cases, after the handle is placed, I will add extra carvings to complete the design story. With this frog cup, I carved some plant patterns to bring the frog into a more natural design. Once the handles are attached, I cover them loosely with plastic and let them slowly dry for a day or two, and then take the plastic off and let the mugs dry completely. Once they are bone dry, they are ready to be placed in a kiln and to be bisque fired. I fired my Bisque kiln to 04, which is 1940 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1060 degrees Celsius. It takes about 12 hours to get up to temperature and 12 hours to cool. Once the kiln is cooled, I unload and get ready to glaze. Bisque firing before glazing is a very important step to prepare the clay for glazing by hardening the clay body and making it porous enough to absorb glaze. I begin my glazing process by first mixing up iron oxide. I get it in a powder form and mix it with water. I use the iron oxide as a wash to accentuate the details of my sculptures and carvings by first painting on a layer of iron oxide onto the areas that I'll be leaving unglazed and in a raw clay form. The iron oxide will create more depth in the patterns and create really beautiful natural shading. Every one of my functional pieces are painted on the bottoms with this mixture. Once they've all been painted, I go and wipe off the layer of oxide. This leaves the iron in the carved areas and creates some beautiful depth and shading. When glazing, I use a combination of painting on the glazes with a brush or applying the glazes to details with a fine-lined glazing applicator bottle. This technique can save time when glazing more intricate details and needing a continuous flow of glaze. I use a lot of celadon glazes to accentuate other glazes by layering, and use a sponge to clean up and wipe away any excess glaze that has made its way outside of the design. Some of the glazes I use are poured directly onto the pots and poured out in one swift gesture. I pour as much as I can and go back with a paintbrush to get into all the details. I could wax the areas that I don't want glazed and dip the whole piece, but I found that it doesn't really save me much time with these sculptural mugs because either way I have to paint on a layer. I love layered glazes and combining them to create interesting glaze reactions. Once the pots are glazed, they're ready to be fired. I'm firing my electric kiln to cone 6 at 2200 degrees Fahrenheit or 1200 degrees Celsius. I place the mugs as closely as possible without touching. If the glazes touch, they will fuse together and become one. Once loaded, the kiln is ready to fire. It takes 12 to 15 hours for my electric kiln to reach temperature and around 12 to 16 hours to cool. It's important that the kiln cools to a temperature that I can handle the pieces without gloves. If the pieces are unloaded too soon and too hot, it can create thermal shock and weaken the pieces or even crack. Here are some of the results of this firing. If this video was helpful, inspiring, or if there's something you'd like to see me create in the future, I'd love to hear what your favorite piece was from this video. Please like, subscribe, and share with a friend.